Hello YouTube, hope you're having a great day today. Today I'm going to take a look at another collection, a short story that was written by Algernon Blackwood that I have in this collection here of some of his best short stories. I've already looked at The Willows, which is considered by many to be one of the best horror story of all time. It was a short story that was a very long short story. It's almost novella length. It's about 40-45 pages long. And that one was considered by many people to be one of the best short stories in the horror genre, including people like H.P. Lovecraft and many others. It's considered a classic in the genre. And so Algernon Blackwood himself wrote many stories in sort of this horror genre and so forth, and is considered by many to be one of the best ones to ever write, and I would agree with that. What Blackwood is particularly good at is he's probably one of the best people I've ever read at sort of marrying this sense of wonder and awe, and that's awesome and majestic, with this sense of fear and trepidation and, oh my god, I don't want that to happen. And he can really sort of twin those together at the same time in a way that I think is he's probably the best person to ever master that, and so forth. And while there have been other writers that have come down the path that may have had the occasional story, or occasionally do it like an H.P. Lovecraft, there will be some of his stories that I think does it very well. In fact, I think one of his last stories is, I think, really good at doing that. It may have been a breakthrough for him. But it's also other writers too, like Ramsey Campbell. That was something he really tried to do too, and although he started out just kind of as a horror writer, by the time he gets to novels like Midnight Sun and such, Ramsey Campbell also is going to be somebody who has really started to master sort of the Blackwood style. Something that he was able to do straight out of the gate. For those of you who might be interested, Algernon Blackwood is definitely much like his characters. He's a loner, he's optimistic, he's an antiquarian in that he collects and researches things. He really enjoys sort of darker things, mysteries, and those spiritualists. He is actually a member during the time that he lived during something called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which was this big belief in spiritualism that was going on in the UK at the time. Many famous writers were a member of that, and as well as artists and other things. Probably the most famous would be either Arthur Machen, who was a fantasy writer at the time, fantasy horror and so forth, or a certain Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, famous as the writer of Sherlock Holmes, but then also wrote many other works too. And so I would say that probably those are good examples of kind of writers and artists that were members of this order. They believed in spiritualism. They believed there were things happening like ghosts, fairies, and so forth, that there was actually a truth to them, that there were actually things that were occurring, and so forth. And there was actually a couple of, later on it would be revealed, like maybe decades later, that they were hoaxes, but there were like these sightings of fairies and pictures of them and such that were happening at the time that were really widespread and believed, especially in the UK circles, in the press, and among the UK people. So this was not something that would have been unusual for the time. And again, Algernon Blackwood is definitely a believer that there are things out there beyond us, and he is also incredibly good at writing it. And I believe that the short story we're about to take a look at, The Glamour on the Snow, is a good example of his more spiritual kind of side on the thing. Now, his stories are going to tend to have very different scenes, very different settings, very different things that are happening. And it's hard to classify all of his works into like one simple genre or subgenre even of horror. For example, The Willows, which I've already had, and I would agree with many that it's one of the best horror stories of all time. And especially horror shorts, is incredibly good, and I've already reviewed it for you myself. And that is more of a Cthulhu mythos, Arthur Machen, The World Doesn't Care for You style of writing that I think is very different. But what I do think, again, that sort of, so there are some of those things out there that are more in that sort of, cosmic indifference. The people don't care about you. There's so many, we're little insects against the size of man, and so forth. But I also think, again, there's also, here you're seeing a much more grounded, a much more realistic story and so forth. And this will be set in the Alps and such. Now, I'm not sure if Algernon Blackwood had ever been to the Alps or the mountains or so forth. It definitely seems like he has from this story. This story lives, breathes snow, ice, snowfall, living in the Alps and its culture. And in fact, he's writing this, and it's actually, this short story is probably published in 1911 and published, he probably wrote it in 1911, it was probably published in 1912, although we don't know for a lot of his short stories when he wrote them specifically, so it could have been a couple of years earlier, because he wrote so many of them, and he would self-publish them and then publish others in pulp magazines. And he was heavily published and anthologized even during his time, because he was really considered this kind of great literary treasure from horror. and sort of this weird side of writing. But again, this story is, I think, incredibly well set in the Alps, and will show you it's much more grounded and so forth. So I'm not sure if he spent a lot of time there or not, but it definitely feels like he's been in the mountains. And as somebody who grew up in the mountains of Appalachia in the wintertime, and man, I got to tell you, winter was the best time of the year growing up in central Appalachia, in the heart of, you know, West Virginia and such. And it was just so much fun. The snow on the grounds and the fresh snowfall, and the world would change under this sort of canopy of snow from the sky that fell from the sky and so forth. And it was just incredibly intoxicating as a child, as an adult, and so forth, growing up in that era. And so he really, I think, nails it with his descriptions of snow and culture and so forth. Also, when he's writing this, there appears to probably have been a culture clash at that time, as the locals, that he calls peasants, but the locals aren't that are there are been pushing back against the tourists, and the tourists are there don't look down on the locals and so forth. So there has been this sort of culture clash there in this center part of the Alps, which seems probably like it may very well have been the case, because this would have been early in the Alps sort of, you know, tourist destination and so forth. This might have been one of the first generation or two of it as a ski tourist destination with all these hotels and so forth. And our main character is going to be staying, our point of view character is going to be staying at one of these places. He's going to be a tourist, although he's there for a longer period of time. So he's actually living in the village in the post office rather than a hotel. Although he'll go and visit the hotel regularly to be public, to dance. He loves doing ski sports and so forth. But he's mainly a writer. And like Algernon Blackwood, he's positive, he's a loner, he's kind of never really saw himself in romantic things. I would not be surprised if some sort of a psychoanalytic aspect of Algernon Blackwood showed up, that he's probably asexual. I would not be surprised if that were the case from how he writes and how his characters tend to be, and so forth. And that's the case with our main character, point of view character too, in the Glamour on the Snow. You're going to find out that he's you know, almost as old as I am, and probably as wrinkled and so forth, but he's only had one love in his life, and that was for a very short time, and it was a very long time ago, and he's never really been caught up in sort of a romantic thing at all since then, and that was when he was young, very, very young, decades and decades ago. So he's just never really been that sort of a thing. And that definitely feels kind of asexual to me, and so forth, as I hear him talk about it and such. And then again, he also will talk about, but then of course, he's going to be going out, he's going to ski, or actually he's going to skate in a midnight skating rink after there was an ice carnival, and he stays, and because he wants to skate alone. And he's going to be joined by this masked woman who doesn't know, and so forth, and she will appear to be very young, very lithe, incredibly good on the skates and the ice. They talk very little. He doesn't want to break sort of the majesty of them skating. They're going to skate for much longer, for hours, than he originally intended, and so forth. He eventually goes back, but before he does, she agrees to come back and meet him again. And so that's kind of the first, I don't know, act of the short story. It's about 15 pages long, so it'll be about 5 pages in. And then the second act will be with him trying to find out who she is, where he can find him again. And then the third act will be, okay, now what? Okay, who is she? How can I find her? And so forth. So there's 3 separate acts, basically, in this 15-page short story. Now, it's not a particular, unlike some of his well-known things like the Willows or the Wendigo, this is actually a relatively short, normal-sized short story. It's only 15 pages in my larger collection. I have read it twice before, but I went ahead and reread it again today because I really do like it. It's actually my second favorite story in this collection after the Willows, and this is, you know, a typical kind of collection of the best of his sort of writings during his time. I actually like it better than the Wendigo, which is why I'm giving it to you now, and so forth. And I also think there's a lot of sort of traditional sort of fun things that are happening with this story that you can give you a chance to get started with Algernon Blackwood. What he is like as a writer, what he's like of his world building, how he twins these two senses of awe and horror at the same time, and does an incredibly well job at it. And again, I think he's probably the best writer out there at doing that. So there again, that's the Glamour on the Snow for you. Let me know if you liked it or not in the comments below, if whether you agree with it or disagree with it, or if you want to talk about anything in the story. I'm also happy to engage you with other Blackwood stories, because if you have read some of his but not this one and so forth, I'd be happy to talk with you about them more, about what you think of him as a writer, whether you think he's one of the best or not, or if he's overrated. I'm happy to engage you with that more. And then finally, hey, if you took some time out of your day, I really do appreciate it, to spend on this video. We all have busy days and busy lives, so the fact that you spent 10 minutes with me, I really appreciate that. So thanks again. Have a good one.